Good evening, everyone. We're here for another webinar by NIFTA, and as has become customary, it starts with a little bit of a welcome note and introduction to NIFTA, which I'll just run through quickly. And I'll make it especially quick because today we have a particularly impressive and large panel, and I don't want to take time away from them. So let me just go straight ahead into the presentation, which should give you an idea of NIFTA if you haven't already got to know about it. So the Association of NIFTA Alumni, NIFTA for short, is an association which has been created a few years ago to represent uh, about 30,000 alumni who have graduated from the National Institute of Fashion Technology. The alumni actually lead and influence global business worth tens of billions of dollars. They're working across the entire value chain at different levels and in all kinds of sectors, including raw materials, manufacturing, brand building, retail, technology, professional services. So it's quite a diverse and eclectic group. And in that sense, NIFTA is a fairly unique alumni association because it is one institute, but with several disciplines that come together to work for one particular industry. It includes design, it includes management and technology, and I think that's what we're trying to also bring together through this series of webinars so that we have cross-disciplinary thinking which comes together to make a better industry for the future. For members, if you haven't already become, as an alumnus, if you haven't already become a member, please go to the website. The website URL is www.niftalumni.org. It's very simple, niftalumni.org, niftalumni.org. Please register. If you're not a NIFT alumnus, you can still register on the website so that you remain up to date with what's going on within the NIFTA community. We do have the possibility of associate membership as well, and you should actually look at that to get connected to this massive powerhouse of talent and information and business. I would just like to speak about, given the subject of today's webinar, I'd just like to quickly speak about an initiative which is being started by NIFT alumni. And this is called Project Divyasha. It's a compound word made out of light and hope, and essentially focused on those workers who are getting affected by this whole pandemic and the industry as it is suffering. Some of the most vulnerable people are getting affected at the lowermost end of the industry. So what is happening now is within this initiative, NIFT alumni are getting together to put some seed funds and inviting designs for products which would be offered up for sale, and the proceeds would, apart from the manufacturing cost itself, the proceeds would actually be donated partially through an honorarium back to the design creator, who can choose to donate that to the cause, and the objective being a donation to those people directly who are being affected by the pandemic, who are at the risk of losing or have already lost their livelihood, uh, to work with organizations to ensure that they can bridge this gap, be it weeks or months. We need to work together to bridge this gap. So that's the initiative. We'll talk about it a little bit more later. But for the moment, I'd just like to mention the website again, niftalumni.org. Make sure that you go there and register. This particular session is particularly important because we've got a massive, massive problem across the world. Certainly, some countries have been more vocal about it. But sitting in India as we are, I think the number of people involved in the apparel, textile, and lifestyle sector is humongous. And there is a huge impact from the slowdown, from the shutdown of factories, from the stoppage of business in retail markets, not only in India, but across the world. And some of those issues are actually being talked about quite a bit, but we've got a panel today which I think will come at the issues from multiple angles. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the panel to Lakshmi. And Lakshmi, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Devanshu. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Firstly, welcome everybody, and a special welcome to the panelists. Thank you, Devanshu, for making this happen. Um, why is this an important time to converge around the issue of keeping workers center stage? The world is in the throes of a global crisis, the likes of what our generation has probably never seen. And I'm not sure we really know what the impact is going to be in the medium to longer term. But we can already feel the short term impact. And if we come back to the industry, to the apparel and textile industry in India, we're talking about, if we look just at the export segment, for example, the direct impact of what is happening with lockdown and with a whole host of other business related issues, which we will be discussing during the session today. There is a direct impact on 12.1 million workers in the factories themselves. This is the first tier units. And then if we look at the other layers within the supply chain, we are looking at close to 40 million workers if we look at the entire RMG industry. What is their current, what is their future, how is industry going to be dealing with all of this, who are the critical stakeholders, why is it important to come together. These are the different perspectives that will be shared. We've tried to have a blend amongst the panelists of people who are looking at this at a macro level, at a global level, internationally, as well as people who are on the ground doing the work in the communities. So we hope that this kind of cross pollination of information, ideas, etc., is going to help. We are also very, very honored to have two international, very, very special guests with us. And you'll be hearing Marsha and Mark during the session as well. So because we have to hear them all, let me, without any further ado, start off with our first round of questions. So because we have multiple panelists, the format that we are following in this session is a Q&A. So we are going to be putting two questions to each panelist, and they will be answering in a focused and concise way. So let's start with Roshan. Roshan, please introduce yourself once I hand the mic over to you. Roshan is an apparel exporter. And the question to you, Roshan, is can you tell us how this pandemic has affected not just your business, but the industry at large? And what is your greatest concern regarding the workers at this point? So over to you, Roshan.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you, Nifta, for inviting me here. I want to start with saying that we are at an unprecedented situation today, where where the world has just collapsed with coronavirus. We, as an exporter, we have issues of loss of orders. We have issues of holding of orders. Most of the international customers have held up their orders or cancelled their orders without liability. So, as an exporter, the biggest challenge we feel right now is going to be the working capital issues in the short term, and that impacts the workers directly. So, uh, we don't know how long will the lockdown last for us, but whenever it finishes, we also don't know what we are going to start when the lockdown finishes. What are we going to produce? What are you going to sell? Because most of our orders are on hold right now. So this is the biggest challenge which an exporter is experiencing right now. And what how how does he survive, if at all, a very short term in the next 3 months, where he'll have next to nothing business, and he will have to survive his overheads. So most of our exporters who were already struggling with the business which was going on for the last 1.5 years, the coronavirus has just accelerated the whole situation, and most of us are feeling pressures on our working capital. Uh, till now, the government has not come to any great help to the textile industry as of now, but we are expecting some package from our Prime Minister. But having said that, it's a grave situation, and we'll have to work on our working capital for the next 3 to 4 months so that we can survive in the long term in this industry. and this affects the workers directly. So we'll have to see how we can engage with our workers, how we can see that we don't lose too many jobs. At the same time, as a company, we survive. I think this is the situation we are in right now. To answer your question, Lakshman.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Roshan. Bharti, over to you. The next question, Bharti will introduce herself. She works for the ILO. Bharti, the question to you is, what do you see? 90% of our workforce is in the informal economy. What do you see as the major challenges for informal workers, especially women, in the global and domestic supply chains in the context of the pandemic? And how would it impact their fundamental right at work and attaining decent work for all, which is a part of the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals number 8? How do you see an impact on all of these fundamental rights in the midst of this chaos? Over to you, Bharti.
Thanks, Lakshmi. I'm Bharti. I work with the ILO. I work on sustainable global supply chains in South Asia, and mostly focusing on the lower tiers of the global supply chain, especially in the garment, metal, and handicraft sector. I think, if we look at COVID, the human dimensions of COVID pandemic reach far beyond the critical health response. And everyone, all aspects of our future will be affected, whether they are economic, social, or developmental. And therefore, our responses need to be very urgent, coordinated, not just at the level of the country, but also on a global scale, and should be able to deliver immediately to those who are in need. Uh, we have been talking about sustainable development goals, and sustainable development goal 8 links to many other sustainable development goals. The issue is how will we able to meet it. If we talk about fundamental principles and rights at work, which every worker should be entitled to, basically we are talking about 4 different rights. The first right is right to work in freedom and in the conditions of dignity and equality. The second is free from child labor. The third is being able to join an association or organization of your own choosing, whether it's a union, whether it's a collective, and should be able to collectively bargain for working conditions, wages, social security. And the fourth one is about equality and non-discrimination. So if we look at the situation now, whether it's COVID or any other crisis, we many times see that these 4 basic fundamental or core rights are actually impacted the most, and they're most critical for any work. They form the basis of any work and the rights of the workers. If
Thank
you look at
you.
the supply
Yes.
chain, okay.
Go on, go on.
So I was just saying that if you look at the supply chain, the need of the supply chain is flexibility, and it is the need of the business. But what we also see, as you mentioned, that apart from the formal enterprises, there's a huge proportion of informal workers who are also connected to the supply chain, and it's also the need of the business. But if we look at the rights of these invisible workers, who could be casual workers, contract workers, piece rated workers, home based workers, or workers working in the lowest tiers of micro, small, home based enterprises, collectives, those workers tend to remain invisible. And what we've seen is that, for example, if we look at forced labor, we see there's a tendency to increase. Forced labor tends to increase during these crises, whether it is exploiting the vulnerability of the workers, or using restriction of movement, not allowing them to go anywhere, or withholding their wages, making them work at lower wages, forcing overtime. Also looking at having debt bondage, promising money in lieu of the labor against which they pledged their labor, and also for example, abusive working conditions. And in this case, it becomes far more relevant because we need to make sure that when the business starts, their health and safety is protected. So the working conditions need to be good. Similarly, child labor also tends to increase because organizations are facing a wage crunch already. So in those situations, in the previous crisis, we've also seen that the incidence of child labor and hazardous child labor increases. So especially where a huge proportion is informal sector connected to the global or domestic supply chains. In terms of unionizing and organizing, again, these workers are not organized and unionized. And lastly, from the perspective of non-discrimination and equality, these workers are not covered by the labor legislations. They do not have the same rights as other workers. They also, suffer multiple discriminations. Apart from that, being a woman, many times they also don't perceive themselves as workers and therefore do not demand the rights which are available to other workers generally. So, in these conditions, we really need to make sure that all these basic four fundamental or core principles are kept in focus. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you very much, Bharti, for that overview. And you will have to, and I think organizations like the ILO will have to constantly continue to remind, the world about these four fundamental rights, as everything kind of reconfigures, post the pandemic. So thank you. The next question is to you, Professor Dev Nathan. You've been on the ground with your networks to assess the impact of the pandemic on the workforce. What are you finding on the ground? What is the actual situation for the Indian workers today across the country, particularly in the apparel and textile space?
Okay. Yeah, I'm Dev Nathan. I work with the Institute for Human Development. I also work with Society for Labor and Development. Well, looking at it from the point of view of an economist, what is very stark is the analysis that we can have famine with a huge amount of food stocks available. I mean, India has 60 million tons of food in their godowns, but we see hunger all around us with people not having food. So as Amartya Sen had seen it, famines are not caused by a shortage of food. Famines are caused by people not having the entitlements to that food which is available. So how do you get an entitlement? You get an entitlement by earning an income. The income of contract workers or other workers in the garment industry has virtually collapsed. Only permanent workers have been paid some amount. We hear from here in Gurgaon and Tirupur and even Bangalore that many companies have paid permanent workers for the period up to 24th of 22nd of March when the lockdown started. But for the month of April, we don't know, nobody knows whether they will get anything in early May when they should be getting for the month of April. Some companies are saying, well, we'll give for 50%, but now they reduced it to 30 or 20%. But for the contract workers, there is nothing. They say, oh, these are piece-rated workers and we can't pay them. Of course, for the home workers also, there is nothing because they are even further subcontracted away from the factory. So what has happened is that these people's entitlements through their own earnings have collapsed. That is the first condition that we are seeing. So what do you do in a situation like this? You have to then depend either on savings or you have to depend on the state coming in to provide an entitlement as on the basis of rights. But unfortunately, our state is unwilling to do that for whatever the reason. Instead, they are forcing these workers to depend on charity of people like you and me, who they make us feel good because we can put in a little money and help people be fed. But this is the most undignified condition in which they are forced to live, where they have to line up from 6 in the morning to get some food at 10 or 11, and then come back again and line up at 6 in the evening or 4 in the evening to get the second meal that they can get. I saw the other day, we were fortunate to be able to go out to the medical store and the bank, and on the roadside, we saw these many women sitting by the roadside in Gurgaon, which is where I live. And this is where these are workers who may have been in the garment factories or they may have been domestic workers. They were clearly not beggars whom we otherwise see on our streets, but they were clearly workers. But what is the dignity they have when they're sitting on the roadside waiting for somebody to come and feed them? So this is what the situation, not the situation, but the actions and inactions have led them into. Yes, there is a collapse of incomes, we accept that, but there is a responsibility for that collapse, which we'll discuss later, and how to handle it. But the point is, what has happened with the workers, they have been reduced from people with entitlements and rights, they have been reduced to people depending on charity. So this is what the situation is. As I said, some companies are paying them, but we don't know how much they will pay. Why? Because they need to retain skilled workers. That is what they look at. Or the rest we can pick up off the street. Anyway, it doesn't take very long to train a worker, and they will come because, 3, 4, 5 days, and you can get a worker to be able to work in your assembly line of garment production. But skilled workers you require, so you're willing to pay them a little bit. But for those whom you think you can pick up off the street, you're not going to be able to get them. You think you can get them just off the street. But one thing, it becomes very clear when I talk to people around here, a lot of workers are going away. They've been so traumatized by this experience, which they have never happened before in anybody's history. I mean, I have seen famines in Maharashtra in 1971 and 72, but I've never seen anything like this. We've never seen, none of us have seen this sight of people thinking they can walk 200, 300, 500 kilometers back home. Can you even imagine people thinking that they're in that desperate situation, but the only option for them is to walk back home? Why? Because the only safety net they have is the rural home, the rural economy, run largely by the women who are left behind. So there's that feminization of the safety net. This has happened all over, not just here. It happened in China, it happened in Indonesia, in Thailand, in the time of the financial crisis of the 1990s. When the men lost their jobs in the city, what did they do? They went back home to the villages where they were sustained by the safety net of women working on the fields. So we are pushing that. Instead of having a safety net which is dignified, which is based on rights, we have a safety net based on charity and on the women of the rural economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you. You always sort of state it as is, and this is deeply concerning because obviously charity is not a sustainable model, and till the industry doesn't stand strongly on its feet with support and stimulus from the government and others, it's going to be a difficult, sort of future our workers and all of us face. My next question is to you, Marsha. Thank you so much for joining us from the United States. You've been gathering data from suppliers about the purchasing practices of their buyers for several years now. And most recently, about these practices post the pandemic, the response of the brands that is negatively impacting supply chain. What are the decisions brands and retailers are taking that is most negatively impacting its workers down the supply chain? And this goes back to the point that Roshan made about, orders being cancelled and so on and so forth. So over to you, Marsha. Yes.
Great. Thank you, Lakshmi, and thank you, Nift and Devanshu, for inviting me. Right. So I have done research for decades on the global apparel industry and kind of how business impacts the suppliers and their workers. And that led us to start Better Buying that in 2015 at the University of Delaware, where I'm a professor. And that was to gather insights from suppliers at scale and from around the world about specific companies' purchasing practices and how those day-to-day business actions impacted both the supplier business and also workplace conditions and workers. And so we were already seeing a lot of different practices that impacted businesses and workers in what we might call normal business conditions. So when the pandemic started and we started hearing cancellation of orders, we did jump back out and do a short survey with suppliers to get an understanding globally what was happening, what was the situation they were facing, but also then to get their inputs on best practices they were seeing, because there's a lot out there right now about all the terrible things that are happening, but not a lot directed at, okay, what do we do differently now in the near term and in the future as we get back to business. So Lakshmi, your question then was, well, what did we see as some of the worst things that were happening? And that's really the breaking of contractual obligations. We heard from 70% of suppliers that they were experiencing canceled orders. 66% reported that volumes of existing orders were being reduced. 60% said delivery terms were changing, that delivery was being pushed back. Another 41% talked about payment terms being extended. And then others, smaller amount at that moment, talked about the reductions to the order price that they were experiencing. And so I think the Professor Dave has really eloquently talked about why that's an impact to workers. You know, a lot of times in our industry, we've spent a lot of time talking about the impact of excessive overtime. What's really probably most important and more important for workers is not having enough work. And that's for workers in factories and the home workers that we're talking about. You know, we saw that when we were doing research in India in the informal sector a few decades ago. So, you know, if workers have no employment without their suppliers, and without employment and a paycheck, you know, they face hunger and other challenges. But this is a long-term problem too, because if you don't save the supplier now, there's not going to be a job for those workers to come back to as well. So it just makes everything even more problematic. It's really a catch-22. You can't have work without workers, and you can't have workers without work. Workers and suppliers are really essential to the industry, both now and in the recovery that we'll face. Thank you.
Thank you, Marsha. And I'll come back to you later about how do we get the brands to hear this message loud and clear. Subhadra, well, you probably have a role to play in that. So Subhadra, she heads the Fair Labor Association in India. And so the question to you, Subhadra, is how are migrant women workers being impacted in the apparel factories? And what are the challenges you're seeing? And your second question is, what role is the FLA, being a global MSI? What are you doing? What is the role you're playing to address this issue with your member brands to protect and ensure the rights of the workers? So Subhadra, over to you. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Lakshmi, and thank you, NIFT, for giving this platform. And I would like to introduce, I'm Subhadra, and I represent the Fair Labor Association, and I take care of South Asia and Southeast Asia. I would like to share that, this is a time where, the world is facing with a dreadful pandemic, and it's absolutely unexpected halt for all of us. And we know that right now the most worst hit and affected are the vulnerable, as Professor Dave had rightly mentioned, and of course the women migrant workers from the supply chains. But before I get into your question, Lakshmi, I would like to respond quickly that FLA is a multi-stakeholder non-profit organization, and we have 50 plus apparel and footwear companies, and our primary focus is to address labor rights and protect workers' rights worldwide through accountability, transparency, accreditation, assessments, and through engagement with civil society and unions. Now, looking into the scenario where, we see that these are really difficult times for, women workers, especially who are coming from various parts of India. And if I may focus and, talk about the South Indian factories, where we have a tremendous inflow of migrant workers coming from various states of Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and Bengal and Jharkhand. So, they are their day-to-day dependency is on their employers and on their wages. And thousands of workers have actually, lost their jobs, and they have not yet got their salaries, as Professor Dev rightly mentioned. Some of the factories have definitely, there are issues where the March salary are only paid till 22nd or 23rd March. So wages are definitely not paid. And as you rightly said that, there is no savings for them. Hunger level has gone up. There are, added problem for the migrant workers also, because, in some states like Tamil Nadu, they don't have any access to economic packages. So state has no provision for the PDS, the public distribution system for migrant workers, because, they belong to different states. So migrant workers are not getting their emergency relief. So ultimately, no social and financial safety nets for workers, And there are, as you know, that some of the factories also have hostels for young women workers. So we have also heard that in some of the hostels, the workers are only getting once a meal in a day. They're only getting one meal in a day. So there are also issues of discrimination because, there are migrant workers, there are language barriers. And of course, the worst hit are the contract and the piece rate women workers. There are also mental health issues. And, there is a need of, there is a dire need of counseling and, domestic violence issues. So these are the reality and, the problems that is basically faced by, various states. Though, in Karnataka, I would say that there have been, this is not yet official and it's not yet out in a written circular, but recently on 20th April, there was a tripartite meeting between the government, the management of the factories and the workers union, which is welcoming. And there was a decision taken that the employer has to pay wages to the workers till the lockdown period, which is till 3rd May. And so in the first week of May, the salaries should be actually paid to the workers. But the catch and the challenge here is, all brands and our members need to be aware of these kind of government and legislative notifications, regulations. Sometimes this gets missed out. Now, Lakshmi, and which are related to COVID-19, and it's changing every day. So, Lakshmi, coming to your second question, which is, what is the role of an MSI, a multi-stakeholder initiative like Fair Labor Association, I would say that, as I look at it, I look at it as a two-pronged approach. And, we have taken a very strong stand with our member brands with a specific guidance document to all of our member brands and our affiliates, which is there available on the website. To summarize quickly, I would say that, of course, canceling of orders should not be the first response at all. That should not be, taken, as the first response. So do not cancel orders which have already, where the products have been already completed or even started. We are encouraging our members to have constant dialogue and open communication with our suppliers, and also to look into the fact that workers are able to address their grievances. So the grievance mechanism should be accessible to workers during this dire need and during this crisis, and it should be strengthened, and more strong approaches should be taken, and absolutely to follow a more regular and legislative mandate. And here FLA's role is also important. We are taking care that, the regular notifications and legislative mandates that are coming from the government in each region and each country are communicated to our brands. And of course, going beyond all that labor, rights or labor codes, we also encourage brands and individuals to come and take relief and contribution, and get more into relief work. So I think and specifically when it comes to migrant workers, to take extra precautionary measures, because some factories have opened, as and they are into making of masks and protective clothes. So it's important that suppliers provide them safe and clean environment. The accommodation and the hostels should be safe. It should have a safe and proper social distancing norms, and there should not be any layoffs. And here brands and suppliers have to work pretty much in collaboration together. And at last, I think one thing that I would like to kind of share with everybody, that this is a tremendous a crisis that we all are facing, completely unprecedented, and it's important. And I urge everyone to engage with credible CSOs and unions and contribute, our bit that we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Subhadra. I think it's really critical to understand that if we all don't come together, something at this scale can't be addressed. It's positive that the government is talking to the industry and the unions in Karnataka. But I have to say, if we look at the scale of cancelled order, discounted orders, and the pressure put on these suppliers, and the lack of liquidity that they have, they're not going to be able to just pay wages without work happening or without some kind of a governmental stimulus. So it's really, really important that the entire onus of the worker benefits, should go beyond just the supplier, unless they have access to work and liquidity. Most of them work on overdraft and all of that. We also do have some questions coming in on YouTube. So those of you who have the YouTube links, I'm not sure we'll be able to take all of that. We still have a number of speakers to go through, but those of you who are on YouTube when others are speaking, if you'd like to answer some of them, Marsha, there's questions for you and others. So please check the YouTube chat as well, those of you who can. All right, we move on now to Rakesh from Tradecraft. Rakesh, the question to you is, we do understand that the informal space of workers is really, really complex. Tradecraft is an organization which has been, working on the fair trade agenda for more than 4 decades. You've been in India, I know, for a number of decades as well. What are you seeing through your on-the-ground programs? What is the impact on the informal spaces? And I'm actually going to club the second question as well. What do you think should be the short-term relief? And you can take your second question, which is, how are you Tradecraft dealing with the issue of increased vulnerability through your programs? What do you think needs to be done even in the longer term to rehabilitate workers so that they have access to sustainable, dignified livelihoods? So that is my question to you, Rakesh. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Lakshmi, and thank you, Nifta and Devansu, for providing this platform to speak. Yes, my name is Rakesh Subkar. I work with Tradecraft, and we promote fair trade principles in supply chains. And we work quite extensively with workers, especially in the informal space, workspaces, both in agriculture as well as in the textile and apparel sector. Across India, covering the whole of India, as well as some of the neighboring countries like Nepal and Bangladesh. Now, on the question around the short-term impact and then the situation with the workers in the informal space, what I would like to I'd like to start by giving the nature of this pandemic. Just like the virus, as we know, it impacts those people with pre-existing vulnerabilities and comorbidities much more intensely, in the physiological sense. The pandemic also, if you look at the characteristic, it is impacting those who are particularly vulnerable, the poorest section of the society, far more intensively than the likes of you and me. We are facing a lockdown and we are kind of locked down at our home situation. We can still work from home, but the workers, especially those workers who work in the informal space, who don't have a written contract, they're not on the payrolls, they don't have access to any of the social security system, and also especially those that are migrants, who don't have even access to the state's relief measures, like the ration card for the food relief that is being provided. They are the worst sufferer, and as a number of speakers have shared before, it has led to hunger, it has led to destitution pretty much for a number of these workers. And what we have seen that, in specifically in the cluster of Delhi NCR region, if you remember, I think this lockdown and the pandemic has followed very closely. Just before this, there was the violence in the northeastern part of Delhi, in the Delhi-Noida border region. So a lot of informal work, outsourced work that happens in the apparel sector are actually located in some of those locations in Govindpuri and some of those localities. So the workers are just recovering from those, the violent riot kind of situation, which have stopped work for almost a couple of weeks. And just as they were recovering and getting back to workspace, this pandemic and the lockdown has hit. So there has been an extended period of no income, which has really put them into a destitution system. What is worse is that people who are in the informal space, they have not even received payment for the work they had already done and supplied, because they work through subcontractors and agents, and then the work that they had done and supplied in the month of March, they were supposed to get paid by the third or fourth week of March. And just as the lockdown was announced, their sub-agents or subcontractors have simply not contacted them, have not got paid themselves, I guess. And these workers who have this like a sacking without settlement of your previous salary for the last few weeks of work they have done. Of course, and one data that I would like to quote here is the study by CMIE, the center that monitors the economic situation in India. Their data is clearly showing that there has been a spike in both the unemployment rate, but also in terms of there is a drop in labor force participation rate in India. Before the lockdown came, already we were at a 45-year high in terms of the unemployment rates, but also the labor force participation rate, the number of people in the working age group of 15 to 60 who are looking for work, who are interested in being part of the workforce, that which was somewhere around 55 to 60% in India before the lockdown. In the survey report that has come out 2 weeks into the lockdown, that rate has come down to 43%. And what does that reflect? That reflects that the workers have really lost hope. They don't have a hope of finding employment, so they're not even looking for employment. There's this significant drop of almost 10 to 12% in a matter of 2 weeks, shows that these people who have gone back to their native villages and rural areas, and they have simply no hope of finding work. They're right now not in the lookout for work. And this is really a crisis situation that needs to be solved. And that That's where I would kind of come to the second part of the question that you asked. What needs to be done in terms of rehabilitating these workers, and in the medium to long term in terms of restoring the supply chain and the workforce. And obviously, we as Tradecraft, we work with a number of partner organizations in this informal space. In fact, currently we are implementing a program called the Hidden Home Workers. And in fact, some of our co-panelists like Navya from the HomeNet South Asia, they're one of our partner organizations. We work very closely with Seva Bharat in Delhi, and with another NGO called Save in Tirupur. And across all this cluster, we are supporting the informal sector workers to find to one, make sure that they could be connected to the government supported or other CSOs provided relief systems. Also, wherever possible, link them to the kind of ration system or food relief that is being provided. As well as some of the clusters, our partners are looking at creating orders for manufacturing of masks or personal protection equipment, and channelize those to the home workers, because they are actively looking out for work. They have not had work for almost a month and a half. Now, what needs to happen in the medium to long term, of course, is that we need to make sure that we get back the workers to work. We need to restore their dignity. They're not destitutes, they're not beggars, they're not looking for charity. They're looking at work, and we need to create systems by which work could come back, and the supply chains could be restored, and work could come back. And for that, I think what is important is we need to win back the trust of the workers in this pandemic situation. What the supply chain actors have really lost is the trust of the poorest or the most vulnerable workers, that there is no one to look after our interest, or if a crisis comes, there is no one who can protect our rights. So we need to make sure that those provisions are announced, and I don't think it will be only the brands or the suppliers who would be responsible. Maybe the government, which has stepped in and taken such drastic measures in order to contain the virus, also has to come and announce some of the packages which could have in fairly drastic measures, like paying, say, a month's rent, a month's salary in advance to the workers to get them back to work, because a lot of them have also lost their rental accommodation. They've gone back, they have to come back and find the renting place and things like that. Similarly, I think as we restore these supply chains, I think the vulnerability of the informal sector and the informal workers, which has been highlighted because of this pandemic, that needs to be corrected. I think there is a need for greater transparency in the supply chain. We don't say that outsourced work or home-based work should not be done. It should be. It is an essential component of the supply chain, but the transparency related to how the workflow happens, what kind of payment measures are there, that needs to be out in the open, and the brands need to be aware of the informal workers down the supply chain, and make sure that their interests are protected, and the compliance mechanisms are inclusive, so that it includes the provisions for the home-based workers or the informal workers. I'll probably stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rakesh. Marsha, this is a very, very critical message for you to carry back to the brands and retailers you work with, that their workforce responsibilities do not end with the first tier suppliers, but go all the way down the supply chain. There's a repetitive theme that is beginning to build up about the responsibilities of various stakeholder groups, and the government has a very critical role to play at this point. And so what we are hearing is, while they did drastic things to contain the virus, they need to do something equally drastic to preserve the employment, the mental, emotional, and physical health of India's workforce, which is really our asset. Our people are our assets. So I think that's a very, very important thing. In continuation of this focus on the informal part of the supply chain, I now invite Navya D'Souza from HomeNet South Asia. Navya, your two questions are: who are these home-based workers in the garment supply chain? And what are you seeing from your on-the-field, connections and work with them? And secondly, in terms of specific, what do you think, what are some of the specific interventions that government and brands should make at this time to protect the most vulnerable of these workers, the home workers?
Good evening, Lakshmi. Thank you for that. And thank you, Nifta, for having me on this platform. My name is Navya D'Souza. I am the Communications and Program Manager at HomeNet South Asia. We are a network of home-based worker organizations across 8 countries in this region. Quickly starting off, just an introduction to home-based workers. Home-based workers are workers who produce goods and services from in and around their homes. An estimate says that India is home to over 37.4 million home-based workers. Many of these are women. So home-based workers usually are of two types. One is the independent own account worker who sources raw material on her own and makes products and sells them on her own. But mostly in India and across South Asia, you find home workers or piece rate workers who work for a wage for each piece that they have made. Um, and it is estimated that there are around 5 million home workers just in the garment supply chains in India. On the outset, I would like to say that these supply chains tend to be very, very exploitative, and the problems that are being focused on and are being aggravated and are being brought forth for home workers during COVID are not new. The fact is that home workers have never been recognized either by governments and by most brands. And because of this non recognition, their problems are manifold at this point of time. I think a lot of the panelists before me highlighted the problems that home workers are facing at this point of time. Home workers, in fact, were the first of the informal economy to feel the reality of COVID. Because a lot of inputs and supplies come in from China, work for them started dwindling down as early as January. And work has completely, even before the lockdown started, by March, there was absolutely no work for them to access. The issue also is that just like factory workers, they too have not been paid for previous work done, and they have no way to kind of access those payments. Exporters, factory workers who have been unionized can go up to a brand and say, hey, we haven't been paid, please pay up. But home-based workers, because they're not even recognized as workers, can't even do that. So it has become a matter of survival for most home-based workers. It has become a matter of putting one square meal on the plate. It has become a matter of possibly having their children drop out of school because they can't afford fees in the coming months. There's also the issue of migrant home-based workers who are stuck in cities like Tirupur and Dhaka and Kathmandu and can't travel back home, and they have no access to ration cards, and therefore they're living on the 500 rupees that has been deposited possibly in their Jandan accounts, which last for what, 2 days, 3 days? And they're, of course, living, as Professor Devnathan said, they're living off charity, and there's no dignity to that. There's also one other aspect that I would like to highlight, and I think uh, Bharti brought out the fact about the forced labor. What we found that in the aftermath of the Nepal earthquake was that violence and harassment of home-based workers increased exponentially. A lot of home-based workers reported that they were asked for sexual favors by middlemen and contractors in exchange for the little work that was around. And in many cases, they couldn't even say no because it was a matter of feeding the family or themselves. So yes, that's the first bit.
Thank
The
you. And
second
Navya,
bit,
yeah, in a minute, because it's just time is short. So if you could just
oh,
quickly address the second
oh,
bit as
sure,
well. Yeah,
sure,
thanks.
sure, absolutely, absolutely. So firstly, the government will have to now decide what it is going to do. Is it going to bail out the big corporates and hope that it trickles down to the workers, or will it actually put workers center stage? That's the main decision that the government has to make. Second of all, you will have to recognize these workers right now and include them in your programs. If you do not that you set up, it will not trickle down to the last year. Um, Ensure that brands stay back. Ensure that they stay back, that they invest, continue to provide work, not just pay payments now, but continue to pay, create and provide jobs in, in the next few, in the next, I mean, in the coming days, in the coming years. Sorry. Second of all, I think India has social enterprises and cooperatives that are very unique to this region that include and organize home-based workers, support these enterprises and cooperatives so that many of them are at the risk of going under at this point of time. So they will need tax cuts, they will need incentives, that they will need financial support. So ensure that you extend that support. And I mean, at the beginning of this session, you talked about designers and working with artisans and everything. Artisans are largely considered self-employed. A lot of artisans are home-based workers. Artisans are usually, when you call them artisans, usually they go into the category of being self-employed and therefore not, eligible for, say, social security. But when you artisans are workers, and you have to ensure that they are called workers and they are recognized in policy, and you give them, social access to social security and all the other rights as workers. Second of all, brands. There's a report that says that the top 5 fast fashion brands, their owners, um, collectively their net worth is more than 18 billion, which was the entire export supply of India in 2016. So brands will have to step up and show solidarity with the workers at this point of time. It is an unprecedented situation and it calls for unprecedented action. Let there be no doubt about that. You have reaped profits for decades because of these workers. And right now, it is the time to ensure that your payments reach all your export houses, and then pressurize them to ensure that they pay everyone across their supply chain. And B, once passes, you will have to recognize home-based workers and ensure that they too receive social security, and other measures. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Navya. A very, very important point that, you have to, the brands and their board and their shareholders, this is a time to show solidarity to all those workers who have produced for them, and to ensure that the industry stays alive and thrives, because if the exporters don't have orders, then nothing is going to go down the supply chain. So these sort of times require creative coming together and cohesion. I think this is really, really important. We move now to look quickly at some of the solutions. And again, I may not be able to go second round to everybody, but we have Professor Mark Anna with us, joining us from Penn State University. And Mark has done some phenomenal work with the Bangladesh industry post the pandemic as well. Mark, you've been looking at some very, very interesting ways of getting money to the workers. Can you tell us about what is happening in Bangladesh right now? Maybe there is something that we can pick up in India too. And so really over to you, Mark, before we look at how much of time we still have, and otherwise I'll have to wind up and do a quick summary. So over to you, Professor Mark Anna.
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you all for the great work you're doing and documenting these issues and speaking out about them. So quickly, a couple of things, just some context before getting into what's going on now and some of the solutions. So I've been researching the industry for a long time. In fact, I might have been the one that did the report on India, where I documented this question of CEO income and value and so on. So there's a lot of inequality. As Marcia was saying, these problems are not new. They've just been greatly exacerbated by the crisis. So we were hearing these reports starting from Bangladesh is where I heard them from colleagues I've been working with for a very long time, of these abrupt and total cancellations of orders. It totaled over $3 billion in Bangladesh very quickly. We decided to do a survey about that to document the cancellations and the impact on workers. We found 54% of enterprises had to close down most of their operations as a result of these cancellations. 74% of workers were being furloughed without pay because of the lack of money. 80% were being fired without severance. The report, just to give you some context, it was picked up in the New York Times, it was picked up in other publications. Within hours, 2 major buyers changed their position and said they would pay up in full. We then revised the report. We put in an addendum and we listed the 14 top buyers who had not paid up. Within 1 day after that revised report, 4 more buyers said they would pay up in full. We then decided to, this is with the Worker Rights Consortium, to put a tracker online listing the companies that had paid up and the ones that hadn't, and we're updating that every day. And we're now up to 12 major buyers, we list them there, who are agreeing to pay up in full. The list, however, is longer of the ones that are still not agreeing to pay up in full. If we go back, just as my own sort of back of the envelope calculations of that 3.6 billion owed in Bangladesh, probably about 1 billion now is being paid. So this is the situation that, with the implications on the ground, is really absolute desperation, very similar to what we've heard in India. In the case of Bangladesh, we're talking about 4.1 million workers. You take into consideration the families that depend on their income, it's 20 million people. In Bangladesh, on average, they're making about $100 a month. So what happened with the government side? The government has agreed to step in and provide $588 million directly for garment worker wages. And a couple of interesting things about the way the government is doing that. One, they're saying that money should go through a respected commercial bank directly to the workers. So they're not saying we just give it to the supplier's bank account and they distribute it. It's actually, we get the worker information ID and it goes through directly through the commercial bank to the workers. The second thing the Bangladesh government is saying is that you cannot access this money. And I should say it's a government-backed loan of at 2%. This is not a free handout. You cannot access it unless you guarantee you will not lay off your workers. And there's a debate about that. But to get that money, you have to maintain that worker employment. One challenge with it, and then I'm going to wrap up with another quick point, is at the time this crisis hit, 60 to 80% of workers were on cash payments. So it required a rapid transition to digital direct deposit payments. And the discussion about homework, precarious work, women at the bottom of the supply chain being most adversely impacted, it certainly rings true in Bangladesh. They were predominantly the ones receiving cash payments. They're not often showing up on payrolls, and the challenge of getting money to them is really quite significant. But that, so far, there's some reports it's been moving forward in the payments, but about 350 factories, maybe 400,000 workers still have not been paid. And I want to add just with one last reflection, we get into conditionality and moving it back, for example, to the US. The US started with $2.2 trillion in bailout money. A lot of that is going to buyers, brands, and retailers in the garment sector. What I think needs to be done in that case is a conditionality to receive that bailout money should be that these big buyers in these supply chains pay up on their liabilities. They pay up on what they owe to suppliers in Bangladesh, India, and beyond. These are where the majority of the workers are in the supply chains. If we do not take care of them, we will see a humanitarian crisis. We're already starting to see it. That humanitarian crisis will only get worse, and it could eventually convert into political instability in some cases. So I think this is in all of our interest for humanitarian reasons and for questions of political stability to address these problems, address them quickly and address them fully.
Thank you so much, Mark. I wonder if you would consider having a COVID tracker for the Indian industry as well. I think we need it here as well to see how many brands are honoring their, sort of contracts and how many are canceling. But because you're absolutely right, the pressure you guys have put through mapping this has really started to show positive changes in Bangladesh. And, the Indian industry has a lot at stake here as well. So I think I know there are conversations happening and you're working, you are in touch with other colleagues in the network. So I hope we'll have something specific like this coming out for India really, really quickly as well, because I think it is needed. Yes. Yes,
Let's
Mark.
say just 2
Yes.
seconds on that. Sorry. We're
Sure.
tracking the buyers, and every conversation we have with the buyers, we're having conversations almost every day with them. They're saying, okay, we're going to pay up. And we'll say, yeah, but when you say that, we wrote about Bangladesh, but you must be saying you're going to pay up for your entire global supply chain. We don't put them on that list of paying up unless we can confirm that they're paying up for all their suppliers. This is not just for Bangladesh. And certainly for suppliers they aren't listening, let us know if you have any documentation on this. We want to track this for everyone. So thank you for mentioning that.
That's great, Mark. And we will be in touch offline on this because, I have heard from suppliers that some brands are doing it differently for Bangladesh and differently for India. So anyway, to all the suppliers, who are on this call, this is Mark Anna. Devanshu can give you his contact details. And if you know me, then we'll put you in touch with Mark so you can have your direct conversations as well. Thank you so much, Mark, for everything that you're doing at this point. So NIFTA has kindly given us a few more minutes. So I'm going to go back to the solution section. Over to you very, very quickly, Bharti. So really 1 to 2 statements. What do you feel, what do you see as the way forward, and what roles do you think the different groups, particularly the governments and brands, should be playing at this time from ILO's perspective?
Thanks, Lakshmi. I think many countries have already introduced unprecedented stimulus packages to protect societies and economies, and also to keep the cash flowing to workers and also to the businesses. I think what is very critical is that to maximize the effectiveness of these measures, it is essential for governments to actually work with employers, organizations, trade unions, and come up with practical solutions which keep people safe and to protect jobs. Now, having said that, there are two kinds of responses that we can envisage. One is short-term and immediate responses, and the other is a medium-term for which we really need to wait a little bit more to assess the impact, both economic, labor, and human impact. For the short-term ones, I think 3 things are critical. How do we protect and support jobs and people? I'm talking about wages, social protection, health, basic necessities for health and shelter, and having jobs. Second is about protecting workers at the workplaces. So as the businesses are opening up, how do businesses open? What kind of support they would need to make the work again restart, the economy to restart? And third is about protecting the businesses themselves. So what kind of support packages are needed for short term as well as for medium term? And these things have to be done keeping 2 core things in mind, and those 2 are the fundamental principles and rights at work and the principle of social dialogue, which is very, very critical, and whole tripartite approach of employers, which includes the brands and the suppliers and the micro small enterprise owners, the workers represented through the trade unions or workers organizations, and the governments. All 3 need to sit together to look at what can be done. And this is really essential for much balanced crisis management and for accelerated recovery during these times. We need to have shared responsibilities for all the 3 actors. And this can also serve as a governance instrument, this whole social dialogue process, and the how measures can be brought together by the consensus of the 3 critical social partners, as we call them. And in this context, last that I want to say is that we also need to look at, we have been discussing a lot about informality. So the 2 ILO conventions, apart from the core labor standards, which I really want this group and also the listeners to focus on, is looking at how do we transition from informality to formality because it offers a sustainable and competitive grounds for businesses as well as workers to enable their rights and government to get their taxes. And the second recommendation, which is very critical in the times of COVID, is the ILO employment and decent work recommendation for peace and resilience. This is recommendation number 205 of 2017. And it also gives how the employers, which are brands, suppliers, retailers, governments, and the workers' organizations can engage with each other in the times of crisis. That's it for me.
Thank you, Bharti. I think coming together is the clarion call. Nothing short of. We probably need, maybe NIFTA can help us with taking lead in this, to really bring together a pan-India coalition of all of these different groups, along with the various CSOs who are working on the ground, to look collectively at what practical, doable solutions should look like for the Indian industry, and then engage with our international partners and stakeholders, networks where Marsha and Mark are all very, very active, and so many others. I think there is a need for coming together, nothing short of a joint voice to the government, to the industry, and from the industry to the world. Is nothing short of that is going to have the kind of impact we'd like to see. So thank you, Bharti. Over to you, Dev. The Asian Flowage Alliance, which has been doing so much of work over the last decade on issues around workers and wages, they came out with a report of findings post the pandemic. What are the highlights and what needs to be done again, to make the industry a secure place for workers? Again, Dev, really, really quickly, but we want to hear what you have to say on this. You're on mute, Dev. I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Okay, now I think I'm okay.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so there has been a lot of mention of how we need to get together, get all various sections together. So I won't repeat all that, that's fine. But I will just say 2 or 3 points which come up in terms of a floor. We are not in a situation, I think we need to think of the immediate. We need to think of the short term, what needs to be done, and medium term, what needs to be done. In the short term, to prevent a famine in India, we need a very quick cash transfer. Indian government boasts that we have a very well-developed digital payment system. So if they could give 500 rupees to large numbers of women, they can give 7,000 rupees quite as easily. It doesn't take much more than a stroke of a pen to transfer all that money. But they don't have the will to do that. They don't want to do that. They want the workers to depend on charity and not have rights. Over time, we need to build up a social security system which will protect workers. It cannot be just done at the level of the brands and the suppliers. Social security comes from the state and from a system that is financed by the state. It can't come by individual employers. Individual employers are not concerned about whether their workers, to put it bluntly, live or die. They want workers who will come off the street, they'll take them. But the government has to be concerned that the workers don't die. That's their concern. That's very important. So we need a social security system. We do have one in the rural areas, the Rural Employment Guarantee, the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee, which worked very well in 2008 at the time of the financial crisis. What did it do? Workers who lost their job in diamond cutting went back to their villages, and there they got work under the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Now the Rural Employment Guarantee is not working, and we don't have anything like that in the cities. We do not have a social security system in the cities. So we need to put our minds to seeing how do we develop a social security system in the cities. Along with that, all the other points that have been made, I don't want to repeat it, about how the industry has to come together and work together in this. You leave the people who are, the people who are in the shadows don't count. But all these millions of workers have been in the shadows. Now you see them only because they're on our TV screens trying to walk home. So we need to be able to work out a system whereby we're able to keep that all going. Thank you.
Thank you, Dev. Marsha, any last advice to the Indian industry on how we can get our act together and continue to not just survive, but hopefully thrive, in the short and medium term?
Yeah, thanks, Laxmi. And it is such a collective global effort that we all need to come together. But, you know, it really does start with that relationship between the buyer and the supplier. And we really want to encourage suppliers to speak up and to make sure that their customers understand, you know, the situation that they're facing. Because, you know, these decisions are being made by brands unilaterally without consultation with their suppliers, without understanding the impact on suppliers, on their workers, and the regional and local context to help out that network. One of the questions that came from YouTube was whether the statistics I was citing earlier were for India specifically, and we did find regional differences in our data. And I would encourage you to look at our report, because we do break out the responses for India when there were significant differences. So some of those were not; those were the more average. But I just want to say, you know, the consultation with suppliers is so critical, because those regional differences reflect that, you know, some suppliers in some regions, and probably some suppliers within those regions, are differently able to help and survive with, you know, for a longer period of time, et cetera. And so if you haven't taken the time to really understand the financial health of your supplier, what they can contribute as we all come together and we all contribute something, then you're making decisions like with a machete when you need to be having the surgical tools to do that. Because without really taking strong consideration of each and every supplier's differing situation, then the brand is just blowing holes in their supply chain. And in the long term, that is not going to help the brand or retailer at all. You're going to want to come back into business. You're going to need your suppliers. They may not be there for you. The workers may not be there for you unless you do this very carefully, and work together to find solutions that keep everybody afloat.
Thank you, Marsha. I would, request each of you, the panelists who are connected on YouTube, to leave your email IDs in the comment section, so that in case some of the listeners here would like to connect with you directly, they can do so. So please, in the YouTube link, leave your and any links to the report. So Mark, your report link, Marsha, your report link. If you can put that out, Dave, any of the report links you'd like to share, let's put it all out there so that these conversations continue. I promised at the start to come back to Roshan, to give him the last word, being, you know, a representative of the industry. I'm coming back to you, Roshan. Where do you think we go from here as the Indian industry, and what is it you need critically now?
So, Lakshmi, I've heard all the speakers talking about workers. So I am the only representative to talk about the industry here. So what I've been speaking to a lot of people, a lot of fellow exporters and all. So what has happened is, uh, we had actually in March, we had 7 days of Holi in northern part of India, and 10 days went into lockdown. So effectively, we worked for about 13 days in March. But most of us have paid complete salaries for March. But now April, and we don't know how May is going to pan out. We are hearing that the lockdowns is going to continue. We are hearing that we'll have to staggered opening of our factories. So none. We are actually do not know how this is going to pan out. And no exporter, for a exporter of my size, I have a salary bill of almost 3.5 crores. If I have to pay March, April, I don't think anybody, you can expect any exporter to just survive by paying without any work. So essentially the government has to really come in right now. We have talked that there is a lot of there's some surplus cash available in the ESIC format, or government has to come up with some kind of a solution for small and medium businesses, especially, who are really struggling for survival right now. So I think for an industry, we need immediate solution or stimulus from the government to help us out and to save the workers' interest in this regard, for the survival of both worker, factories, And having said that, we'll have to understand that the garment industry works on the labor force. It is a labor force is actually essential part of our business. And as a company like mine, we have trained more than 2,000 women workers in lean system of manufacturing in India, in Delhi. So we do not want to retrench, because it's so difficult to create a skill set, then retrench and again create a skill set. So it is not in our interest to do any kind of retrenchment or stop payments for any workers, but at some points we are quite helpless. The working capital is getting completely squeezed, and most of us will not be able to handle it in short term.
Thank you, Roshan. What we are essentially hearing is an SOS, and I know you're not the only one. There are many, many who literally are saying we need to be listened to now. And I hope NIFTA, with all your contacts and connections, there is a way we can get the urgency of this to the government and play a supportive role in putting into place some of these things. The industry has very good ideas in where some of these funds can be found, but there has to be somebody has to sign those documents to make sure that the money reaches the industry and through the industry to the workers or to the workers directly. This is really, really critical. Otherwise, in the next 30 days we are going to have a very, very huge humanitarian crisis. If there's anything this pandemic has taught us, it is just how interconnected our lives are, how interconnected our destinies are, how interconnected this planet is. And I think without understanding, respecting, and appreciating the interconnectedness and drawing upon the tremendous power and resource that is available when we begin to harness the interconnected energies of the dynamic system that we all engage in. I think if we learn to do that, we probably will have many more solutions in navigating the uncertainties in the coming times. So with that, I want to thank each of you for being here, for participating, for sharing. We hope this is a beginning to give some hope and to walk together as a multi-stakeholder community which really, really cares and feels for the industry and the workers. The ready-made garment industry in India is probably the largest employer of labor. If you kind of look at all the ancillaries put together, this is huge. If this industry doesn't survive, it's got huge, longer term implications for India, for the GDP, and so on. So with that message of urgency and thanks to all of you, we'll all be in touch one way or the other. I hand over back to Devanshu for the closing.
Thank you, Lakshmi, and thank you, all of you on the panel. I think we could have done with half a day for this panel because there's so much thought, so much to be done, so many solutions to be thought through in a collective manner at different levels, at the brand and retail level, at the factory level, at the governance level, and actually at the worker, at the individual level. There are so many things which we still need to fix. That the task is just humongous. And I think even thinking about it makes me think that we need to get together much more. As Lakshmi said, I think we need to create offline, online spaces where we can actually come together and create solutions for each other. Just as a last closing, I would like to go back to the small initiative that I had mentioned at the beginning. And I just want to remind you of that. This is the NIFTA Divyasha project. And I'm just trying to get to my screen if I can. Just give me a moment. But since I can't go to the screen, let me just talk through it. So just to remind you, it is a project which is seed funded by a few NIFTA members to support people in the apparel, textile, lifestyle sector who have been impacted by the pandemic, whose livelihoods have been impacted by the pandemic. The idea is to get thematic design and creatives from the community to convert into products. Proceeds from the products after manufacturing expenses would be divided among an honorarium for the designer who has contributed the creative and direct donation to people whose livelihood has been lost due to the pandemic. And what you can do is you can contribute by giving funds to support this project. You can buy the products when they come out, contribute your design ideas, and if your design is selected and if there is an honorarium that's coming your way, maybe you can contribute it back to the project and to its beneficiaries who may need it more. With that, I would like to remind you that there are further webinars coming up. So if you want to stay abreast of what's happening in the industry, and there's a lot of knowledge coming our way, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, go to the NIFTA website, and register yourself so that you don't miss anything that NIFTA is putting out in the next few days. The website again is niftalumni.org, niftalumni.org. Thank you all so much. We've shot well over our time, but I think it's more than worth it. Thank you again, all the panelists, and thank you, Lakshmi, for a fabulous job in moderating.
Thank you. Thank you
so
all.
much.
Thank you so much. Bye.